My daughter always told her friends she was too busy to visit, but the day she found out I still had money left, she suddenly had all the time in the world, and she brought her husband to my own granddaughter's christening just to make sure everyone watched her take it from me. I did not raise my voice. I did not knock over a single chair. I simply walked to the front of that reception hall, set a folder down on the table in front of her, and asked her to open it in front of every single person who'd come to celebrate that baby. By the time she finished reading the first page, her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't hold the paper straight anymore. If you're just joining this story, take a breath, because what I'm about to tell you happened inside my own family, and I still have trouble believing it myself. If you've ever had someone you loved treat your kindness like it was owed to them, hit that like button for me. Subscribe so you don't miss where this goes, and tell me down in the comments where you're watching from tonight and what time it is where you are. It genuinely means something to me to know who's out there listening. My name is Walter Beck. I'm 67 years old, and for almost 40 years I ran a small chain of hardware and building supply stores across central Ohio. Nobody handed me any of it. I started with one cinder block building outside Zanesville that used to be a feed store, and by the time I sold the business 3 years ago, we had 11 locations and 200 employees. I sold because my wife, Doreen, was gone by then, heart failure, sudden, 4 years back, and because my daughter Melissa had just had her first baby, and I wanted to be the kind of grandfather who shows up, not the kind who sends a card. Melissa is 34. She married a man named Craig Dunmore about 6 years ago, an insurance adjuster with a talent for sounding busier and more important than he actually was. I never loved him, but I never said so out loud, because Melissa loved him, and because I promised myself a long time ago I would not be the father who tries to run his daughter's marriage from the sidelines. When their daughter, my granddaughter Ivy, was born, I thought foolishly, I see now that it might soften something in both of them, make them a little more grounded, a little more grateful for what they had instead of what they wanted. 8 months before the christening, I decided it was time to downsize. The house Doreen and I had lived in for 26 years had gotten too big and too quiet for one person, and my knees weren't forgiving me for the stairs anymore. I found a single-story patio home in a retirement community 20 minutes from Melissa, close enough that I could see Ivy grow up, far enough that I wasn't underfoot. Because I was in the middle of finalizing the last pieces of the business sale and didn't want the hassle of managing a real estate closing myself, Craig offered to handle it. He'd done a handful of closings for clients through his adjusting work, he said, knew the title companies, knew how to keep things moving. I trusted him. I wrote a cashier's check for $210,000, the full purchase price, and handed it to my son-in-law, believing I was simplifying my life, not endangering it. 9 days later, I called the title company just to confirm the closing date so I could start packing. The woman on the phone paused for a long moment before she told me, apologetically, that they had no file open under my name, no escrow account, nothing. I told her that couldn't be right, that my son-in-law had handled the paperwork personally. She asked me to hold, checked again, and told me the same thing a second time. I drove to my bank the next morning. I've known the branch manager, a woman named Priscilla Ochoa. For 11 years, she opened my very first business account back when I was still driving my own delivery truck. I asked her to pull the clearance history on the cashier's check. She typed for a while, frowned at her screen the way people do when something doesn't line up, and then printed out the scanned copy of the endorsed check and slid it across the counter to me without a word. I have spent 40 years reading contracts, invoices, and supplier ledgers for a living. I do not miss details. My eyes went straight to the endorsement line on the back, and what I saw there emptied the blood right out of my hands. The payee was not the title company. It was not an escrow account of any kind. My $210,000 had been deposited directly into the operating account of a boat dealership on the west side of Columbus. I thanked Priscilla, folded the printout, and put it in my coat pocket. I did not make a scene in that lobby. I have learned over the course of a long life that the men who scream are rarely the men who win. I walked out to my truck, sat behind the wheel for a long time, and thought about a conversation from 2 weeks before Melissa, calling me, stressed, saying money was tight, that Craig's commission checks had been slow, that they might need help covering Ivy's daycare for a month or two. Tight, she'd said. And yet somehow there was $210,000 sitting inside a boat dealer's account. I drove straight to their house. Craig had inherited a little family money of his own a few years back, and had used most of it as a down payment on a house in a subdivision that was, frankly, well beyond what an insurance adjuster's salary should have supported on its own. As I turned onto their street, I saw it before I even reached the driveway, a 31-foot cabin cruiser sitting on a trailer, gleaming white and blue in the morning sun, dealer tags still zip-tied to the stern. Melissa was standing beside it in a sundress, phone held up high, angling for the perfect shot, laughing at something Craig said as he wiped down the hull with a chamois cloth. I parked 2 houses down and sat there for a moment just watching my daughter photograph a boat bought with the money that was supposed to buy me a home to grow old in. Every one of her poses felt like a small, casual insult to the 26 years Doreen and I had spent scraping together a life, to the 18-hour days I'd put in so that Melissa would never once have to worry about where her next meal was coming from. I got out of the truck and walked up that driveway, feeling something cold and very steady settle into my chest. Craig saw me first. His easy grin dropped the second our eyes met. Melissa lowered her phone, annoyance flickering across her face before she caught herself and rearranged it into something closer to concern. I didn't yell. I pulled the folded bank statement out of my coat and held it out to Craig without a word. He took it, scanned it, and I watched the color drain slowly out of his face like water running out of a sink. "Walt," he started, "I can explain." I told him to go ahead and make it make sense for me, because right now it looked exactly like what it was, my house money sitting in a boat dealer's account. He recovered fast, the way people do when they've rehearsed a lie enough times to believe it themselves. "The seller backed out," he said. "Title issue. Some old lien nobody caught until the last minute. And rather than let the funds sit frozen in escrow for months while lawyers sorted it out, he'd pulled the cash to protect it. And then this was the best part," he said. Brightening, Melissa's freelance bookkeeping business had just landed a huge contract with a marina up on Lake Erie, doing their books and their client outreach, and clients like that expect you to show up looking like you belong on the water. "It was an investment," he said, "in her business, in our family's future." Melissa stepped in on cue, eyes glistening, telling me how sorry she was they hadn't called first, how it had all happened so fast, how she never wanted to use my money but Craig had insisted it was the smart move. She hugged me, her perfume thick and sweet, and murmured that the first big invoice from the marina contract would clear within 30 days, and they'd pay me back every dollar plus interest, and we'd find an even better house for me after that, somewhere with a real yard. I let my shoulders sag. I told them I understood, that I trusted Craig's judgment, that I just wanted everybody happy. Craig beamed at me like a man who'd successfully talked his way past a mall cop. As I turned to walk back to my truck, I caught his reflection in the boat's windshield. He wasn't watching Melissa. He was watching me leave, and the second he thought I was far enough away, he pulled out a second phone, not his usual sleek black one, but a cheap prepaid flip phone, and started typing frantically, thumb moving fast, eyes darting up every few seconds to check the street. A man managing a legitimate marina contract does not carry a burner phone. I drove away with that image burned into my mind, and a very quiet, very cold resolve starting to take root. I didn't go home. I drove to see Ivy that same afternoon, because that had been the plan all along, and because I needed, more than anything, to hold something good in my arms after that driveway. Ivy was 9 months old, round-cheeked, gumming on a teething ring in her high chair when I walked into their kitchen. Melissa had gone upstairs to change, and it was the babysitter, a sweet college girl named Priya, who watched Ivy 3 afternoons a week, who mentioned something in passing that stopped me cold. She said she was glad Ivy was finally sleeping through her afternoon naps again, since for 2 straight weeks the baby had been fussy, feverish, and throwing up almost everything she ate right after Melissa switched her over to a new organic formula supplement. Craig's mother had recommended some powder you mixed into the bottle, supposed to help with iron levels. Priya said she hadn't wanted to say anything to Melissa directly, because Melissa got prickly when anyone questioned Craig's side of the family, but she'd quietly stopped using the powder herself when she was watching Ivy, and the baby had been fine every time. I asked to see the container. Priya pulled it from the back of a cabinet, half hidden behind a stack of cloth napkins, a plain white tub with a handwritten label instead of a printed one. I took it home with me that night, and the next morning I drove it to my old friend Dr. Samuel Reyes, a pediatric pharmacologist I'd known since our daughters were in the same preschool class 30 years earlier. I told him I needed a favor, off the books, no questions asked yet. He called me 2 days later, and his voice had none of its usual warmth in it. He told me the powder was not an iron supplement. It was a concentrated compound containing a sedative typically used in veterinary practice, at a dosage that, for a baby Ivy's size, was dangerously high enough to cause exactly the kind of vomiting, lethargy, and low-grade fever Priya had described, and enough, if continued or increased, to eventually cause real and lasting harm. I sat in my truck outside his office for a long time after that call, feeling something in my chest that I can only describe as the floor giving out from under me. This wasn't neglect. This wasn't an accident. Someone had been deliberately, quietly making my granddaughter sick, on a schedule regular enough that it looked, to any doctor, like a mysterious chronic condition rather than poisoning. And whoever it was had needed Melissa to trust them enough to keep giving it to her own daughter without question. I thought about the burner phone. I thought about the boat. I thought about a woman capable of standing beside a stolen boat taking selfies while her child was sick at home. I did not believe, not for 1 second, that my daughter knew what was in that powder, but I believed with everything in me that Craig did. I went to see my attorney, a woman named Denise Calloway who had handled every contract my business ever signed for over 20 years, and who did not deal in sympathy, only in facts. I told her everything, the diverted check, the boat, the burner phone, the powder. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she told me that before we did anything else, we needed proof, real proof, not suspicion, because if I moved too fast and too loud, Craig would simply destroy whatever was left of the evidence and disappear behind a wall of lawyers paid for with my own stolen money. So I waited, and while I waited, I played the part of the confused, grateful old man who trusted his son-in-law completely. I called Craig 2 days later and apologized for showing up angry at the house. I told him Melissa's happiness meant more to me than any amount of money, and that I wanted to help however I could going forward. I could hear the relief flood into his voice, that particular relaxed arrogance of a man who believes he's gotten away with something. Denise, meanwhile, quietly pulled the county property records tied to my old family land 80 acres out past Zanesville that had been in Doreen's family for 3 generations, mostly farmland now leased out to a local grower, but worth a significant amount given how close the county line had crept toward development in recent years. I had placed that land into an irrevocable trust years earlier specifically so it could never be sold, mortgaged, or leveraged without my direct, in-person, notarized authorization. It was supposed to be untouchable. It took Denise's team 11 days to find what we were both dreading. A commercial lien had been filed against that land 3 weeks earlier, securing a loan of $680,000. My signature was on the document. I had never signed it. It was a careful forgery good enough to fool a bank clerk moving fast, not good enough to fool a document examiner Denise brought in, who confirmed within an hour that the signature had almost certainly been traced from an old contract of mine rather than written freehand. The money from that loan had been wired, through 2 shell companies registered in Craig's mother's maiden name, into the down payment on a vacation condo on Marco Island, Florida, fully furnished, purchased in cash through the final shell company, just 6 days after the loan cleared. I sat across from Denise in her office with that photograph of the condo in front of me, and felt every last soft feeling toward my son-in-law drain out of me for good. He had stolen from me to buy a boat. He had forged my name to steal from my dead wife's family land to buy a second home in Florida. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, my granddaughter had been getting quietly, deliberately poisoned in her own kitchen. This was not a man cutting corners under financial pressure. This was a man executing a plan, patiently, methodically, and he had used my own daughter and granddaughter to do it. I told Denise I did not want a slow legal fight where Craig hired expensive lawyers with my stolen money and dragged this out through depositions for 2 years while Ivy kept eating that powder. I wanted something faster and something final. Denise explained that commercial loans, unlike a simple family loan, get bought and sold on the secondary market constantly. Banks originate them, collect their fees, and often sell the paper off to clear their own books. She proposed setting up an anonymous holding trust and quietly approaching the bank that had issued the fraudulent loan, offering to buy the note outright at a premium steep enough that they'd take the deal without asking many questions. Once we owned that debt, we would own the single most powerful lever over Craig's entire life. Under the loan's standard acceleration clause, any evidence of forged origination documents meant the full balance, the entire $680,000, would become due in full within 24 hours of formal notice. with the land itself subject to immediate seizure if he couldn't produce the cash. I told her to do it. I didn't care what premium we had to pay. While Denise's team quietly bought that debt over the following 11 days, I did something else. I called Priya and asked her, gently, if she would be willing to keep a small recording device, nothing complicated, just a simple audio recorder tucked inside the diaper bag during her afternoon shifts, in case anyone ever asked her anything about what she'd seen. She agreed without hesitation. She'd clearly been uneasy about the powder for weeks, and was relieved someone was finally taking it seriously. 4 days later, that recorder caught something none of us had been prepared for. Craig had stopped by the house in the early afternoon while Melissa was at a client meeting, and thinking only Priya and the baby were home, he'd taken a phone call in the kitchen. Priya couldn't make out every word, but she heard him tell whoever was on the line that once Walt's land money cleared, they needed the kids' pediatric records to show something chronic, developing something that would justify moving Ivy onto a permanent, ongoing specialist formula, so that no one would ever question the powder again, and so that if Melissa ever left him, custody would be far harder for her to win alone with a baby who needed constant specialized care that only he understood. I will admit, hearing that recording played back to me in Denise's office was the closest I have ever come in my life to genuinely wanting to hurt another human being with my own 2 hands. I did not act on that feeling. I let it burn, cold and quiet, and I let it become fuel instead. 3 weeks passed. The christening had been scheduled for months, Melissa's church, a reception afterward at the same banquet hall where she'd had her own confirmation party 20 years earlier. Family and friends from both sides invited. Nearly 150 people. Craig, buoyed by his stolen fortune, had insisted on upgrading the whole event. A live jazz trio, a catering spread that had to have cost more than most people's monthly mortgage, an open bar that ran the entire afternoon. I arrived early with a gift for Ivy tucked under my arm and Denise's manila envelope sitting heavy inside my jacket pocket. I watched Craig work the room like a man who'd already won, shaking hands, laughing too loud, ordering the staff around like he owned the building. Melissa looked tired in a way that worried me, thinner than I remembered, dark circles she'd tried to cover with makeup, and every time Ivy fussed in her arms, I saw Craig's eyes flick toward the diaper bag with a strange, proprietary interest that turned my stomach. Partway through the reception, as the priest finished a short blessing over the baby and the guests raised their glasses, Craig took the microphone from the DJ booth without being asked. He'd had exactly enough champagne to feel bulletproof. He thanked everyone for coming, thanked his own mother extensively, and then, almost as an aside, made a joke about how grateful he was that certain people had finally learned to stop meddling in decisions about his daughter's care and just write the checks instead. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter went through the room. Melissa's smile went brittle. I watched several of her old friends from college exchange a quick, uneasy glance. I stood up slowly from my chair. I did not raise my voice. I walked to the front of the hall, and the room quieted the way rooms do when someone moves with purpose instead of panic. I set the manila envelope down on the head table directly in front of Craig and asked him, in a perfectly calm voice, to open it, because I thought everyone here who loved Melissa and Ivy deserved to understand exactly what they were celebrating today. Craig laughed, a little too loud, told the room I was probably just here to finally hand over my blessing and my checkbook, that I'd taken long enough to accept he was the man of this family now. A few people chuckled along with him, uncertain. He tore the envelope open with the same lazy confidence, and I watched his eyes drop to the first page. The notice of default, the acceleration clause, the demand for $680,000 due in full within 24 hours, and I watched every drop of color leave his face at once. The room had gone completely silent. Melissa, still holding Ivy, stepped closer, asking what was happening in a small, frightened voice. I turned to face the guests, not Craig, and I told them plainly that the land this notice referred to had been in my late wife's family for 3 generations, that Craig had forged my signature to secure a loan against it, and that the money had gone to buy a boat and a vacation condo in Florida, while he told my daughter money was too tight to pay for their own child's daycare. Someone gasped near the back. I kept going. I told them that a 9-month-old baby in this room had been quietly given a veterinary sedative in her bottle for weeks, disguised as a supplement, and that I had the lab results to prove it, and a recording of Craig discussing how to use it to manufacture a custody advantage. Melissa made a sound I will never forget. a kind of strangled cry, and pulled Ivy tighter against her chest, staring at Craig like she was seeing him for the first time in her life. Craig started shouting that I was a bitter, senile old man making up lies to ruin his life, that I'd never accepted him, that this was all some kind of jealous fabrication. He lunged for the envelope like he could somehow take it back. And that was the exact moment the double doors at the back of the hall opened, and Denise walked in beside two investigators from the county prosecutor's financial crimes unit, who I had, with Denise's careful guidance, quietly briefed the week before, once we had the forged loan documents, the toxicology report, and the recording all lined up together into something no court could ignore. They didn't need to raise their voices either. One of them read Craig his rights while the whole room stood frozen, glasses still in hand, the jazz trio silent, the priest standing near the altar with his hand over his mouth. Craig didn't fight them. He just kept looking at Melissa, saying her name over and over, saying he could explain, and Melissa did not look back at him even once. She turned instead and walked straight to me, Ivy pressed against her shoulder, and let me hold both of them right there in the middle of that ruined party, while her husband was led out the side door in handcuffs past 150 stunned guests, holding champagne they no longer wanted to drink. The months since then have not been easy, but they have been honest, and honest has been worth more to me than I ever understood before. Craig is awaiting trial on forgery, fraud, and child endangerment charges, and given the recording and the lab results, Denise tells me a plea deal is the most likely outcome, one that will keep him away from Ivy for a very long time. The land went back into the trust, untouched, the debt fully paid the moment his seized assets were liquidated. Melissa filed for divorce 11 days after the christening and moved back into my old house with Ivy while her own place sells. Ivy's pediatrician confirmed within 2 weeks of stopping the powder that every one of her symptoms cleared up completely, and today she is a loud, healthy, stubborn little girl who has just started pulling herself up on the coffee table and shrieking with delight every time she manages it. Melissa and I don't talk about Craig much. Some evenings I catch her staring at nothing for a long moment, and I don't push her to explain it. What we do instead is sit out on my back porch most nights after Ivy goes down, watching the fireflies come up out of the grass the way they did when Melissa herself was small enough to chase them barefoot across that same yard. Last week she told me, quietly, that she used to think loving someone meant not asking too many questions. I told her that real love asks all the necessary questions, every time, no matter how much it costs you to hear the answers. Family isn't supposed to be the thing that hurts you the most, but sometimes the people closest to us mistake our patience for permission. Loving someone with your whole heart does not mean handing them the keys to destroy you or the people you'd die to protect. Setting a hard boundary, even against your own blood, isn't cruelty, it's how you keep the people you love safe enough to grow old. If any part of this story hit close to home for you, hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and tell me down in the comments about a time you had to protect someone you loved from somebody who was supposed to love them too. I read every single one of them, and I mean that. Trust is a gift, not a blank check. The people who love you most will still ask questions when something feels wrong, because real love protects instead of just believing. What saved this family wasn't anger, it was patience, proof, and the courage to look closely at someone everyone else took at their word. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for the people you love is refuse to look away. A small note for you. This story was written and fictionalized by AI for entertainment, though we hope its life lesson stays with you in a real and positive way.